information services, supporting the exchange of data. It's very much a technical regulation, setting the enabling framework for the development of these services. And it's also a first building block to help and support further the development of MAS. So now what we also recognize is that this first step is not enough, and that we need to look into further into enhancing further data sharing, specifically dynamic data or data related to fairs, to help the development of MAS. So we will be looking at a technical initiative and a new legal framework to support MAS services. But we also understand that a key point is related to business agreements. Commercial challenges are very important when we look at mobility as a service, and we very much want to create a framework of trust for the development of those services. And finally, I would say that we really also want to ensure that the services developed will serve user and help us achieve our objective in terms of sustainability. So we'll also have to respond to certain criteria and to certain public policy objective. So having said that, I now leave the floor to the presentation of the three different projects, and I wish you a good conference.
Thank you very much, Victoire. I mean, the scene is clearly set up now, and I'd like to invite now the first project, which is the MAS for EU. This is going to be presented by Viviane Kiyusi, who is a Senior Research and Business Development Manager and head of the Transport Lab. So she's going now to present through a video the MAS for EU. Guido, I'll leave you launching the video. Very much for this excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Mr. Jones. And now I would like to invite the three speakers to well, turn on your video, your camera, sorry, and your microphone, and we will now start the roundtable and panel discussion. Well, so I invite everyone with well, now around in this session to raise your question to the speakers. Or is there anyone who wants to start? Well, as always, like this, even remotely, the first questions are shine, and then afterwards it goes more. At least yesterday there were a lot of questions. So, well, in the meanwhile, I don't see any question at the moment in the chat box, but I will maybe raise a couple of questions to launch the Q&A. And this is for all of you. And this was already a little bit introduced in the speech of Mr. Jones, the relation of COVID and MAS. But this is something very likely that we should probably need to take more seriously than we anticipated in a way at the beginning. And maybe the first question would be, do you see already negative impact of the COVID in the development of MAS and the possible use of MAS? And well, do you plan, if you have the chance in your project, although it was designed before the COVID happened, so very likely your research activities have not taken that into account, but do you plan to amend a bit your research plan to integrate this aspect in your upcoming research activities, especially in your project? So this is a double question that I'd like to raise to all of you, and maybe I'll start by Viviane, if you want to give your thought on that.
Yes. Especially on the context of the project, we have to admit that it really distorted the pilots that we had in mind, because the MAS situation and the travel ban restricted the user group that we had on board already, and the whole communication strategy we have implemented in order to get them engaged. On the other end, though, because we had to act quickly and we had to be clever on that, we utilized different kind of cookies and actually a survey in order to ask people how MAS could assist the on-demand services side. So on the one hand, we had an issue with the quantitative data, let's say, that we wanted in order to get some actual ideas out, which we changed then to qualitative data collection. We did in-depth interviews with the people that have already participated or the small amount of people that were participating. We extended the interviews around the whole Europe, and we talked to public administrations as well. And at the same time, with UCL, we ran a specific study that had to do with the COVID and how MAS could assist with allowing a different types of service, which were on the on-demand basis. We have seen also in additional projects that the on-demand request for moving from A to B was very proliferate around the Europe area because people avoided utilizing the public means. They didn't want the congestion. So on the research side, probably it created some concerns and, took us out from the comfort zone. On the other end, it creates ideas for the provision of additional services. And somebody that wants to actually implement MAS, they could think of how to include such type of smaller services, minibus services, car sharing services under the MAS framework. So I think I have replied through the experience and through what we have seen happening when we did the turnaround. That's from our end, from the MAS4U end more. And we will have a paper for deriving from the study, which is very relevant to the MAS and COVID very soon.
Thank you very much, Viviane. Roberto, what do you think about, from your point of view, how do you approach this?
So for us, as I mentioned in that presentation, our pilots coincide with the wave, the first wave, the first lockdown of the whole pandemic. So we have to be very quick on our feet and rethink how we did that. So clearly has had an effect, an impact in the way that we have collected data. But at the end, I don't think it has made a huge difference into what our outcomes are, in the sense that MAS is not a static concept, it keeps evolving, and this is just another part of how the whole mobility aspects of in cities in particular, but also between cities and across borders will evolve. So I think whenever there's a challenge, there's an opportunity, and clearly there's been a significant reduction, temporary significant reduction in patronage of public transport, but there's been a significant increase in the use, for instance, of active mobility and micromobility. So I think MAS can be an agent to facilitate those transitions. And in that sense, I think the outlook is still positive for MAS. It can actually adapt quickly and try to restore that patronage of public transport if we utilize the benefits of MAS in the coming months and years. So in that sense, I think there's still a possibility and there's still an opportunity, and MAS still has a role to play.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Peter, how would you like to complement this?
Thank you. Well, timing was really unfortunate for MORE because we were planning from April to go out in our 5 cities and actually work with stakeholders in groups and events to actually discuss how the streets might be reorganized. So obviously we had to think about doing that differently. And in fact, there were 2 phases to the work. One is looking at how the streets operate now and looking at how things might change over the next 20 or 30 years. So we brought forward some of the work, our scenario work, looking at the futures, and managed to reschedule things as best we could. In terms of, as has already been said, I mean, in the short run, the evidence has been that car use has held up, for personal car use has held up, whereas use of public transport in the UK, typically public transport use is down quite a lot. Bus use is down 40 or 50%. rail use is down to about a quarter of what it would normally be expected to be. Walking, cycling has gone up a bit. In the longer term, I think probably three things. I think one, for certain groups anyway, it's demonstrated that a lot can be done remotely as we're able to do this conference. And so I think the expectation is that fewer people will be commuting long distances 5 days a week, but that people have learned and companies have learned that people can work from home at least part of the time. So I think the 5 day a week long distance commute is probably going to reduce, and probably there will be more online shopping and things like that. So there will be, to some extent, a reduction in levels of demand on certain parts of the road network, which will ease the problems in the future. Linked with that also, because people are not commuting every day, they tend to perhaps be spending more time in their local areas. So this is boosting local economies and therefore making it easier for people to walk and cycle these shorter distances. But I think from our point of view, one of the challenges we faced in Moore was to get people to think very radically about the possibility of using road space very differently. And I think COVID has given that shock, and people have implemented experimentally things that even a year ago they wouldn't have thought was possible. And therefore opening up people's thinking in that way, I think is very valuable to get the best out of road space in the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'd like maybe to follow up with the question which is now posted on the chat, which is about defining urban space at the different levels. And the question is it city specific or national or European label? This question, I guess it's probably for Peter and Roberto, but so I start maybe with Peter, if you recognize yourself there. Yeah.
I think effectively it's nested, isn't it? I mean, in terms of the Trans-European network and the urban nodes, that's something that's really defined at the European level, and to some extent we are talking about moving people and goods around Europe, so that sort of sets the European frame. And then we get down to the national, perhaps regional level, where a lot of regulations are actually set nationally, for example. So I know in some countries, I think like Germany, if you want to change parking charges, that actually requires national legislation, whereas in the UK, it can be down to the local authorities to decide on charging levels and things like that. And there are other things decided by the city themselves, again, varying on the degree of autonomy. So I think it's a question of these different spatial levels sort of being nested, and also within different member states, the relative authority of those different levels varying. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Roberto, would you?
Yeah, but absolutely. I think what Peter says in there is absolutely right. It has to be a combination, and the scope in different, the way that legislation is implemented in different member states might vary. So there is a very important need to have a very holistic or system approach in terms of a European-wide definition, but then how it's implemented might require or will require national and local authorities. So there will be some variation. So that overall label will have to be flexible enough to accommodate those differences and that diversity of regulations. But fundamentally, it has to be a combination of both.
Yep. Thank you, Roberto. And Vivian, would you like to say something more there?
I only would like to add here, because mass, the concept of mass is dealing with different topics within the city, rural, urban, peri-urban, and they touch also the cross-border aspect. The issue we have on the definition is that for every country, the definition between urban and a rural area differs significantly. And that is also when we try to define several calls that are released by the European Commission. There is not a unified, let's say, specialized tag. That does not allow researchers as ourselves to do comparisons very easy, because we need to compare things between urban or rural areas across many national borders. And if we cannot do that, then we cannot learn from policies. If we cannot learn from policies and we cannot suggest policies, then we have an issue with implementing something new as the MAS framework is, because it defines that we have to move towards changing regulation, adding new regulation to allow also the cross-border options. There are many discussions, and this is where I want just to reply to the audience, that many different working groups have tried in order to standardize, let's say, in a sort of a way, this understanding. I know that there is a release from the UN Statistical Degree of Urbanization Office, something like that. So this is what we are reading at the moment, and this is what we are trying to show in the between cities discussions. Definitely, it's something that has to be in a sort of a way concretized, because we have to ensure that cities understand the same thing, and especially between countries. And this is what we have also tackled and looked when we looked at the cross-border option at the Greater Luxembourg pilot. If you want to find some research material, I think we have some publications also about this topic on the website, if I'm not mistaken, especially some of the public deliverables. And that's it from my end.
Thank you very much. Well, I'd like to reiterate the invitation to the audience to post your questions on the chat area. And maybe in the meanwhile that we receive another question, we probably could follow up on what was introduced already with the short-term impact of COVID. And you mentioned, Peter, that at the moment we can see clearly a decrease of the public transport, which probably as a consequence also an increase of the car use. There is also clearly an increase of active way of mobility, probably at the expense of public transport. And this is for the short term. But you highlighted more positive, in a way, impact on the long term, maybe highlighting in particular that there would be a decrease of the commuting, at least permanent commuting and rather long distance commuting on 5 days per week. To that extent, there is also some hope that the overall economy and habit will change from maybe boosting more local economy and regional economy. And there are some prospect of reviving more town centers instead of city center, accumulation as we are now. And to that respect, how do you see MAS contributing to this change in a way of reshaping region and towns, so slightly more on the rural area, as Vivian, you introduced it, instead of the current practice, which was only focused on big city and large city? So I start first, maybe with Peter, because you were the first one mentioning it, and then we'll continue with everyone.
Yeah, well, from a couple of things, and I'll answer your specific question. I think one is that a positive that might come out of this is it might be the disparities between the peak and off-peak might reduce, because particularly for the rail side, it's very, very expensive to provide peak capacity that isn't used to anything like the same extent off-peak. Whereas if people only come in coming to work 3 days a week, and if employers can spread that over 5 days, which is in their interest because they will need less office space, then it means that the peak will be slightly less, and therefore the disparity between the peak and off-peak will reduce, and that means that will reduce the operating costs of particularly rail services, or being able to offer a more even service with a good quality of comfort throughout the day. So I think that could be quite valuable. I think the big challenge is, to the extent that people tend to spend more time in their local area or go to local centres, that would be very good for the economy generally. But the question is, what happens to the centre of cities? Will they therefore decline, or potentially have more residents living there and take on a local function, as well as still being the regional centre for major arts and things, administrative centre and things like that? Specifically on the MAS side, again, I think if demand is even out during the day, again, that will make that better able to provide a very good level of service. I mean, some work I've seen in Britain looking at demand responsive transport. The problem in the early pilots anyway is that it's not been possible to satisfy all demand in the peak periods. Therefore, again, if there's a bit of a flattening out of the peak, and if more of these trips are more local, I think mobility as a service, various things on offer, can potentially adapt to that new environment very well and support it.
Thank you very much, Peter. Vivian, would you like to complete on that?
Yes, what is very interesting, and we actually have seen during the study, is that we have seen what we expected, that the demand for travel reduced. The people traveled less and less, especially by public transport. I think that this is something we sort of expected, but really destroyed the plan, because MAS aimed also to reduce the car use. And then we were in a very difficult situation of how to recommend things to the travelers, the experts in the cities. So this type of social distancing had an immediate negative effect, not only on the emission target that we had put and on the services we were trying to, let's say, put under the umbrella of MAS in order to reach into this CO2 reduction, let's say, concept. But the whole switch of COVID, we have seen that affected the subjective well-being of the health status of the citizen, because it resulted in a sort of a way in a social isolation. And sometimes when they use the car or they wanted on-demand services with buses that actually even reduced some bus lines, they were really expressed into limited physical activity. And definitely the cities and the stakeholders from the side of the, let's say, government, they have to be really looking at this switch, because when we avoid the social contact in a sort of a way, this might change the number and the types of the out-of-home activities we do. And our whole profile, our whole traveling profile, people that were using the bus, now they're fearful, and now they want to use the easy way out in a sort of isolated, reduced services for them. But I think we have to invest with good communication on what traveling safely means. You have to keep, sort of the style of cleanliness of yourself, on protecting yourself and the others, and then to assist the people in a sort of influencing in a good way that let's say they utilize other means like walking and cycling that we have seen being improving in a sort of a way. So we can ensure that the citizen, especially nowadays, I don't think that this will last forever, but it will last for a while, will maintain, let's say, the physical status of the person, at least in a satisfactory level of health and well-being. And this is where we need to, let's say, sort of see an opportunity, because there are also business models on this type of, let's say, difficult time for the planet. So new ideas, new business models, everything can exist on the table, but we have first to put the traveler as the main, let's say, point of interest for everyone that is involved into this business. And we shouldn't scare people too much on utilizing new means, but pushing them also for more healthy options. And we have seen that, depending on the strategies and the campaigns of each country, there were many differences there. But we definitely have to see it at an EU level. And that would be a very interesting project as well, to compare between cities on the physical, let's say, status between the citizens during a COVID situation. I don't know if there are calls like that outside, but we could see thoroughly what is working better, how walking and cycling probably could replace other stuff, and see also recreational ways out of this difficult situation. And this is more for policy planners also to consider and try to encourage active travel.
Yep.
That's my point of view.
Yep. Thank you, Viviane, also to complement Peter's words. And we addressed quite well in the aspect of in a way, how can MAS also support this new change in the regional development / towns versus city center and so on? So this is going to be a dynamic process, and it's going to be very important to have it. We have now, you highlighted some particular aspect, Viviane, of the fact that MAS is based on sharing in a way. So the ability of sharing transport, whatever they are, public transport or shared mobility in general. And this COVID, by breaking in a way the social distance, has in a way broken this spirit, at least has put it on hold. And this is indeed a challenge. And so how, taking all this into account, we have two questions that are now posed on the chat box, which very likely goes to the next step. So basically talking about legislation. So the question is, what is the main legislative challenge that you would see, and how this would be better approached at EU, regional or local level? So in other words, is there any priority, or is it to be done at all levels? And the second, in a way, question goes slightly in more detail about that. It's about the aspect of rural and urban, and ask again if there is any experience in including a certain mode of transport, such as carpooling in MAS, and again looking at the legislative aspect. So let's start by Roberto, if you wish to give your point of view, and we'll continue with the others.
Yeah, okay. First of all, apologies for I suddenly disappeared from the panel. I don't know what happened there. So apologies for that. So it's very tricky to give one challenge, okay? We are trying to, so MAS is trying to integrate many different modes and trying to do an awful lot of things. So I think the one thing it probably is essential is making sure that there is no over-regulation and actually create more barriers that than helping in terms of integration. So harmonizing different approaches, I think, is something that is a big challenge, because by nature, mobility, the MAS applications that will be applied at local level, and it will have distinctive local characteristics depending on the culture and on the type of services on the region and so on, and whether they follow one of the different scenarios that I was talking about. So different business models. I don't think there is a universal business model. So depending on those characteristics, those ingredients that you put in the pot, there will be different regulations that will be more relevant than others. So having something, making sure that is harmonization is something that's important. Another example of that is the sale rules that govern the sale of tickets for example, for rail, particularly in countries where there is a significant dominant service provider. How those regulations sometimes can be really, really restrictive, and third parties might have difficulties in offering a crucial component of MAS, which is the mass transit. So that's an issue. And the other one that I can think of, I know the question is only one, that is the passenger rights. And I know that European Commission is working now on the passenger rights legislation. I think that is important for multimodal transport to provide the confidence and the trust that MAS can actually, the users are protected and it can actually be approached. So yeah, those are the kind of legislative conundrums. I don't think there is an answer, but there's quite a handful of conundrums on that front.
Yep, thank you, Roberto. So Peter, would you also tend to agree on the need for harmonization more than extreme regulation or legislations?
Yeah, I think it depends when you actually break it down, what we're specifically talking about. I mean, in terms of safety of vehicles and so on, I think that needs to be, minimum standards, at least nationally, if not at EU level. And as Roberto said, with something like a national rail network, clearly that's got to be sorted out nationally, at least, if not at member state level. In the UK, when it comes to regulating new modes of transport, whether it's e-scooters or bike sharing schemes or services like Uber, that tends to be responsible of the individual city. And so in London, for example, TfL actually proposed to take away Uber's license because it wasn't satisfied with the degree of personal security it was offering customers because of checks on drivers and also standards of reporting problems and things like that. So I think, again, it depends on the different levels, really. Just say two other things. From more point of view, I mean, the other two projects are experts on mass. Our interest in this is mainly, what does it mean for curbside use? And what we see is with more people using services like Uber or take up of bike sharing, whatever it is, that is putting extra pressure on curb space and on footway space. So the question is, how do we try and adopt that? Another comment, I've done that is true in other countries as well, but I think we're seeing a growing urban-rural divide in the UK, in that in larger urban areas, car ownership and car use are definitely going down, and many of the mass services are being taken up quite enthusiastically, as we heard from the first presentation. But when you get into the very small urban areas or the rural areas, car ownership is still rising and car use is still growing. And I don't know if this is a general problem that Europe faces in this sort of growing divide between urban and rural. Thank you.
Yep, very interesting as well. Vivian, would you like to say something to complete what was said?
Yes, I will try and answer first the question number one. We have seen from especially the in-depth interviews with different public administrations and travel operators, how a mass could be implemented, especially on a cross-border trip, and what that entails, and where the missing points of the regulation that are required or changing in the regulation in order to ensure that me as a customer is moving safely from A to B, well protected in terms of the service delivery, and of course being safeguarded that I have my insurance and whatsoever. There are some, let's say, holes in the legislation, because this is a new thing, of how the operation in one country will ensure a very good delivery of the service in a different country, especially on this, let's say, communication between countries, because not the same things are applied in every country. So these are the discussions, and we have done some suggestions for policy recommendations of how we have to do this, let's say, additions in order to safeguard the type of service that we will be offering. Now, one of the points that I've seen on the question B, it has to do with carpooling. Carpooling is a very big story, phenomenal, let's say, in Europe. And why? Because in some countries is something which is very well known, very well accepted and utilized by people. And in some countries, the word does not even exist. This is the same case, for example, in my country of original origin, Greece. It's not something we're using because we are, let's say, a bit lighthearted of who has the responsibility to transfer me. Generally, the overall concept is that it's behind the bars. It's a legal sort of an idea, because that person that will be doing the trip will move anyway to do the trip. And it would be very interesting for a second person to join, because I save money and I pay only the amount that is actually the cost that this guy will do anyway on its own. So then it was very interesting when I looked on several studies how people that they're doing this business are trying to survive, especially in the cases where they have to step out from their home market. For example, in Germany, it's a proliferate, I see, market there. they have accepted it. There are some companies that they are running carpooling. So in order to be able to survive and do an additional, let's say, stepping out and expand the type of services you are giving, that means that you have to adapt to the local language, culture, legality, and geography, because I don't think that all the legislations have considered such a service. And this is the reality in Europe. So this is not something, and you're right, whoever has asked about that, it's not something that is perfectly suited yet and accepted throughout the EU at the moment. But people, due to the dense population, they seem to trigger this request to the higher services political people in order to create and push such ideas. It will take time, though. Between the mass operators, they won't be able, let's say, if they are going to have a 10-country service, to be able to give the same service in all 10 countries, unless this is something which is embedded in the culture and accepted in the legislation. So it requires some campaigning, advertisement, let's say, explanation, and giving appropriate information to the officials. And we see how it will move bit by bit. But definitely, you're right, it's not well accepted everywhere. There are some countries, though, that they are very good, let's say, test beds if we want to see how the service could be, let's say, encompassed and be part of the mass framework.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Vivian. Roberto, would you like? Do you wanted to
just very quickly just add an aspect that seems to be kind of forgotten? Is so patronage and public transport and any of this form other than the private use of cars, it requires trust and advocacy. So what we're seeing is, for instance, in rural areas, if we're looking at carpooling, car sharing, the problem is not just planning your outward trip. You have to go from A to B, but you need to go back home. And that sharing right might not be there. So that trust that you're going to be able to go back home is perhaps a big handicap when you're looking at rural areas. There might be not enough advocacy of the service. So one of the potential challenges in that is just developing this kind of trust, and perhaps mass has a role to play on that. But there is carpooling is a, if I can use the term, a crossroads in terms of being able to develop in those particular areas. Potentially, the potential is huge because there's a lot of private car ownership in rural areas due to the dependency on that rather than public transport. But that return trip is something that can only be developed if there is trust and advocacy, and it's something that we've seen that it can erode the benefits of carpooling.
Yeah, thank you, Roberto. And I think, Peter, you want to add an additional element as well.
Just briefly on what Roberto said about trust, I think that's really important. When people are using their own cars, they feel they're completely in control. When they use another mode, they're relying on other people. And a well-established example in the States, for example, is where on some large sites, employers have been trying to encourage people to share cars or carpool, so they go into work in the same car. And often there's been a reluctance to say, well, that's fine, but what happens if I get a phone call from my school to say my child is sick or something, I need to leave early? What happens then? And so the companies have said, well, in that case, we'll provide a taxi or Uber for you to get you to the school. And it turned out that's very rarely needed, but nevertheless, it gives people trust to try the carpooling. So I think trust is really, and backup is really important.
Yeah, excellent. So trust is indeed important everywhere, actually. And as soon as we share, we need even, this is becoming the critical element. And thank you, Peter, for also giving this example. We have one last question that I would like to have only a very brief comment, because we are 3 minutes before now the end of the session and we need to finish on time. It's a kind of follow-up anyway question to this question of trust and then sharing data and information. And this targets specifically the, in a way, the OEM. So the question is, if you have experience in sharing of car data, and then especially the link with the OEM. So have you been able to connect with them and getting some, let's say, data from them and making value out of it? So please, Vivian, I start with you. You have only 20 seconds, please. There's not only you, it's for everyone, just to finish on time.
All right. There are specialized working groups discussing on the data market economy that should move to a structure where agreements and sharing becomes easy to understand. There are papers out about this topic specifically because we need to move to an open data landscape. You will find interesting details if you go to the Transforming Transport project website. There are some public deliverables especially for that, and policy recommendation documents, plus one prepared by the Big Data Value Association. Feel free to ping me so I can direct you on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Vivian. Roberto.
So we have only 1.5 minutes. So basically, data is essential. We own the data. We are travelers. It's our own data, and I think there's going to be a move towards making sure that we control our data. And for example, legislation and GDPR is supporting that. So I think that in terms of sharing mobility data, it will have to be in terms of what cost, what is the part of the transaction. So it will be a transactional aspect.
Yep. Thank you. Peter? Anything to add?
This hasn't been called for our project, but the OEMs have been talking about, as the cars have more sensors fitted, that they could provide information back to the local authority on things, for example, whether the curbside is being occupied or not in that time. So I think there's huge potential that we haven't really tapped there yet.
Very much for bringing all these elements. And now we have in the last 30 seconds remaining, I would really thank all of you. So Vivian, Peter, and Roberto, great presentation, and well, a very lively discussion for about 40 minutes. Thank you to all the audience. Thank you for your questions. Thanks to Guido for his assistance on the technical side. Thanks to the Commission for setting up the scenes. And thanks, of course, to AirTrack and Lexia for this excellent conference and this nice session. I invite you now to go back to the lobby and enjoy the rest of the event with the exhibition online and anything else you wish to have. Bye-bye, and see you soon.
Take care.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.